The cold, dry wind slapped against Abigail Turner's face as she watched the congregation file into the church from across the dusty street of North Platte, Nebraska. Her gloved hands trembled, not from the biting December air of 1875, but from the overwhelming dread that threatened to collapse her chest each time she attempted to climb those 3 wooden steps. Lucas Vaughn noticed her standing alone, her blue dress whipping around her ankles in the wind. He'd seen her in town before the schoolteacher who had arrived from Boston 6 months prior, but they'd never exchanged more than pleasantries. Today, something in her rigid posture and distant gaze made him rein his horse to a stop. "Morning, Miss Turner," he said, tipping his hat. His deep voice carried over the wind. "Mighty cold to be standing out here." Abigail startled, her wide hazel eyes meeting his. "Mr. Vaughn," she nodded, attempting a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I was about to go in." Lucas dismounted his chestnut mare, tying the reins to a hitching post. He was no regular churchgoer himself, having only come to town for supplies, but he recognized the conflict in her expression. He'd worn it himself many times. "Doesn't look to me like you were about to go anywhere," he said gently, standing a respectful distance away. His weathered face was kind beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "Except maybe back the way you came." Abigail inhaled sharply. "Is it that obvious?" The church bells began to ring, announcing the imminent start of the Sunday service. Several latecomers hurried up the steps, nodding to Lucas and giving curious glances to Abigail. "Been trying to go in every Sunday for 3 months now," she admitted, her voice barely audible above the bells. "Never make it past the steps." Lucas studied her face, noting the faint shadows under her eyes and the tightness around her mouth. At 28, he'd seen enough troubled souls to recognize one standing before him. "Don't reckon God minds much whether you worship him inside or out here," he said, leaning against the hitching post. "Might be he prefers honest doubts to false certainties." Abigail looked at him with surprise. "You're not going to tell me I should go in, that it's my Christian duty?" Lucas shook his head. "Not my place to tell anyone where they ought to be." He glanced at the church doors closing. "Tell you what, Miss Turner, I'll wait right here with you until them bells stop ringing. Then, whether you decide to go in or walk away, at least you won't be doing it alone." Abigail's shoulders relaxed slightly. "You're a strange sort of cowboy, Mr. Vaughn." "So I've been told," he replied with a small smile. "Though around these parts I'm more rancher than cowboy these days." As the bells continued their sonorous call, neither moved toward the church. Instead, they stood in companionable silence, 2 strangers finding unexpected comfort in each other's presence on a cold Nebraska morning. Inside the church, Reverend Howard Miller began leading the congregation in their first hymn. The melodious voices drifted out into the street where Abigail and Lucas remained. "My father was a minister," Abigail said suddenly, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "In Boston. He died last year." Lucas nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. "I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Turner." "Thank you." She twisted her gloved hands together. "Everyone expected me to follow in his footsteps, not as a minister, of course, but as a pillar of the church. I've tried, Mr. Vaughn, but every time I approach those doors, I hear his voice giving sermons that no longer bring me comfort. I feel hollow." "Grief has a way of hollowing a person out," Lucas agreed. "Takes time to fill up again, and sometimes what fills you is different than before." Abigail studied him, noticing for the first time the depth in his blue eyes. "You speak as though you know." "Lost my wife and daughter to typhoid 3 years back," he said simply, without self-pity. Took me a long while before I could look at a church without wanting to tear it down with my bare hands. I'm so sorry, Abigail whispered, feeling a connection forming between them. How did you find your way back? Lucas looked thoughtfully at the steeple. Never did, not fully. Found a different path, I suppose. Some days are still harder than others. The bells began to slow, their peals more measured as they prepared to cease. Abigail's gaze returned to the church doors. I came to North Platte to start fresh, she said, to be something other than Reverend Turner's daughter, the dutiful, pious daughter. But old habits are hard to break, and every Sunday I find myself here, trying and failing to be who I was. The final bell rang out and then silence fell. The service had begun. Seems to me, Lucas said quietly, that you're exactly where you need to be right now, not in there. He nodded toward the church. But here, being honest with yourself. Abigail felt tears prick her eyes. Thank you for waiting with me, Mr. Vaughn. I think I'll walk back home now. Would you allow me to accompany you? He asked, untying his horse. I'd welcome the conversation, if you don't mind. Abigail hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd like that. As they walked away from the church, the mare plodding quietly behind them, Abigail felt a weight lifting from her shoulders, not the full burden of her grief or doubt, but enough to breathe a little easier. And for the first time since arriving in North Platte, she didn't feel quite so alone. Do you have far to go, Miss Turner? Lucas asked as they turned onto Oak Street, where modest wooden houses lined both sides. Just 3 more blocks, she replied. The schoolhouse has living quarters attached. It's small, but it suits me well enough. Lucas nodded appreciatively. Practical arrangement. The town's fortunate to have found a teacher willing to come all this way. I needed the distance, Abigail admitted. Boston held too many memories, though I must say I wasn't quite prepared for the realities of prairie life. A smile tugged at Lucas's mouth. Let me guess, the wind, the dust, and the distinct lack of literary salons? Abigail laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. All of the above, plus the scorpions in my boots and the way everyone knows my business before I do. Small-town living has its drawbacks, Lucas agreed. Though folks here look out for each other, too. They walked in comfortable silence for a moment, their boots crunching on the hard, packed dirt. Several townsfolk nodded greetings as they passed, curious eyes taking in the unexpected pairing of the reserved schoolteacher and the rancher. I've heard talk of your ranch, Abigail said. The Triple V, isn't it? They say you've built something impressive these past few years. Lucas adjusted his hat against the sun. It's coming along. Started with 40 acres and a dream after the war. Now up to 300 acres, a decent herd of Herefords, and enough worries to keep me up at night. The war? Abigail glanced at him. You fought? Union cavalry, he confirmed, his expression growing distant. Came west afterward, like many did. Needed open skies after all that bloodshed. Abigail nodded, understanding more about the quiet strength he carried. My father's church was a stop on the Underground Railroad before the war. He taught me that standing for what's right often means standing apart from the crowd. Sounds like a man of principle, Lucas said. You must have admired him greatly. I did, Abigail said softly. That's partly why his death has been so complicated. He was larger than life, always so certain of God's plan. When he fell ill, he maintained that same certainty to the end. But I couldn't understand why God would take someone who served him so faithfully. They reached a modest white clapboard building with a small bell tower, the schoolhouse. Adjacent was a simple dwelling with curtained windows and a small porch where a rocking chair sat beside a table stacked with books. "This is me," Abigail said, stopping at the gate. She hesitated, then added, "Would you care for some coffee, Mr. Vaughn? It's the least I can offer after your kindness this morning." Lucas considered her invitation, aware of the watchful eyes of neighbors and the strict social conventions of the town. "I'd be honored, Miss Turner, but perhaps another time would be more suitable. Sunday morning calls might set tongues wagging." Abigail's cheeks colored slightly. "Of course. How thoughtless of me." "Not at all," Lucas assured her quickly. "I'd welcome your company, but I wouldn't want to cause you any difficulty with the school board. They tend to hold their teachers to exacting standards." Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. "Yes, they made that abundantly clear when they hired me. A teacher's moral character must be beyond reproach," she quoted with a wry smile. "Perhaps I could call on you properly sometime," Lucas suggested. "Maybe bring some of those books you mentioned wanting to read?" Abigail brightened. "You remembered that? From the general store last month? You were quite passionate about needing more than just McGuffey's readers for your advanced students," Lucas said with a smile. "I have a modest library at the ranch. You're welcome to borrow whatever might be useful." "That's very kind of you, Mr. Vaughn." "Lucas, please." "Lucas," she repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Abigail, at least when we're not in front of my students." "Abigail," he nodded, the name feeling right on his lips. "I'll bring those books by next Saturday, if that suits you." "It does," she agreed, opening her gate. "Thank you again for this morning. It meant more than I can express." Lucas tipped his hat. Sometimes all a person needs is someone to stand beside them through the hard parts. As he mounted his horse and rode away, Abigail watched him go, reflecting on the unexpected connection they'd formed. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of something she'd thought long extinguished hope. The week passed in a blur of lessons, marking papers and thoughts of Lucas Vaughn. Abigail found herself looking forward to Saturday with an anticipation that both excited and alarmed her. It had been a long time since she'd allowed herself to feel such interest in another person. When Saturday afternoon arrived, Abigail had just finished sweeping her small porch when she spotted Lucas riding toward her home, saddlebags bulging with what she presumed were books. He wore a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard, she noticed with a flutter in her stomach. "Good afternoon," she called as he dismounted. "Afternoon, Abigail," he replied, securing his horse before approaching with the saddlebags. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day." "Not at all. I've just put coffee on." She gestured to the chairs on her porch. "Would you like to sit out here? It's unusually mild today." Lucas nodded, setting the heavy bags down. "I brought a selection. Wasn't sure what would interest you most." They settled into the chairs, and Abigail poured coffee into 2 chipped but clean cups. Lucas opened the saddlebags, revealing a treasure trove of volumes. "Dickens, Austen, some Shakespeare, and a few scientific journals that might interest your older students," he explained, laying them out on the small table. Abigail's eyes widened. "This is wonderful. How did you come by such a collection out here?" "My mother was a great believer in education," Lucas explained, sipping his coffee. "When I came west, her books came with me. I've added to them over the years when I could." "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," he agreed. "Taught me to read by lamplight after long days working our farm in Pennsylvania. Said books would take me places our poverty never could." As they discussed the books, their conversation flowed easily from literature to their respective childhoods to the challenges of prairie life. Hours passed without either noticing until the lengthening shadows reminded them of the time. "I should go," Lucas said reluctantly, standing. But I've enjoyed this afternoon tremendously. Abigail rose as well. As have I. Thank you for the books. I'll take good care of them. I know you will. He hesitated, then added, There's a social at the Grange Hall next Friday. Would you consider attending with me? Abigail felt her pulse quicken. Yes, I'd like that very much. His smile warmed her more than the afternoon sun. I'll call for you at 7 then. As he rode away, Abigail hugged one of the books to her chest, feeling both excited and terrified by the possibilities unfolding before her. The next day, Abigail once again found herself standing across from the church as the bells rang. This time, however, she wasn't alone in her struggle. Lucas appeared beside her, as if their meeting the previous Sunday had established a silent agreement. Thought I might find you here, he said quietly. I'm still trying, she admitted. Every week I try. That takes courage, he said, offering his arm. Would you like to try together this week? Abigail looked at the church doors, then back at Lucas. Not yet, but thank you for offering. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Then we'll wait out here again, if that's all right with you. As the bells rang and then stopped, they stood together in companionable silence. Afterward they walked again, talking more openly about their pasts and the paths that had led them to North Platte. Lucas told her about establishing his ranch after years of drifting following the war, about the struggle to build something lasting in a land that could be as cruel as it was beautiful. Abigail shared stories of her childhood in her father's shadow, her dreams of creating a school where children could question and explore rather than simply memorize. This pattern continued in the weeks that followed. Sunday mornings waiting outside the church together, Saturday afternoons discussing books on her porch, and increasingly frequent meetings in town that raised eyebrows among the gossips, but were conducted with impeccable propriety. At the social, Lucas surprised everyone, especially Abigail, by being an accomplished dancer. My mother insisted, he explained with a grin, as he guided her expertly through a waltz. Said no son of hers would stomp around a dance floor like a wounded buffalo. Abigail laughed, more freely than she had in years. She was a wise woman indeed. As winter gave way to spring, something new bloomed between them. Abigail found herself watching for Lucas whenever she was in town, and he found reasons to visit North Platte more frequently than his ranch business strictly required. One evening in late April, as they walked along the river after a picnic supper, Lucas stopped beneath a cottonwood tree just beginning to leaf out. Abigail, he said, his voice more serious than she'd heard before. These past few months have been the happiest I've known since losing my family. I never expected to feel this way again. Abigail's heart raced. I feel the same way, she admitted. You've brought light back into my life when I thought I would always walk in shadows. Lucas took her hands in his blue eyes earnest. I don't want to rush you, but I need you to know my feelings. I've come to care for you deeply more than care. I believe I'm falling in love with you. Tears welled in Abigail's eyes. Lucas, You don't need to say anything now, he assured her quickly. I know you're still healing, still finding your way. I just wanted you to know where I stand. Abigail squeezed his hands. I'm falling in love with you too, she whispered. It terrifies me, but it's true. The joy that transformed his face was worth every moment of fear she'd felt in speaking those words. Slowly, respectfully, he leaned forward and kissed her a gentle, questioning kiss that she answered with growing certainty. When they parted, both were smiling despite the tears in their eyes. We'll take this slowly, Lucas promised, one step at a time. Like waiting outside the church, Abigail said softly. Exactly like that. As spring turned to summer, their courtship became the talk of North Platte. The schoolteacher and the rancher made an unlikely but well-matched pair, people agreed. Even the more conservative members of the community approved when Lucas began accompanying Abigail to various school functions, lending his support to her educational initiatives. By August, Lucas had asked Abigail to marry him, presenting her with his mother's simple gold ring beneath the same cottonwood tree where they'd first declared their feelings. Yes, she'd said without hesitation, letting him slide the ring onto her finger. 1,000 times yes. They set the date for October, when the harvest would be in and the weather still fair enough for travel. Abigail wrote to her few remaining relatives in Boston, inviting them to the wedding. Lucas set his ranch hands to building an addition to his house, a proper library for his book-loving bride. As their wedding day approached, however, Abigail found herself increasingly troubled. The ceremony was to take place in the very church she still couldn't bring herself to enter. Each Sunday, she and Lucas continued their tradition of waiting outside during services, but as the wedding drew nearer, her anxiety grew. 2 weeks before the wedding, Abigail finally confessed her fears to Lucas as they sat by the fire in his ranch house. "I don't think I can do it," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. "I want to marry you more than anything, but the thought of walking into that church, of standing before Reverend Miller where my father should be," she shook her head. "It feels like a betrayal of everything." Lucas pulled her close, stroking her hair. "Then we won't get married there," he said simply. Abigail pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean? Where else could we?" "Right here," he said, gesturing around them. "On the ranch, under the open sky. We can ask Reverend Miller to perform the ceremony outside, or Judge Wilson if you'd prefer." "You would do that? Change everything we've planned?" Lucas cupped her face in his hands. "Abigail, I would marry you in a stable if that's what would bring you peace. The where doesn't matter to me, only the who." Fresh tears spilled down Abigail's cheeks. But these were tears of relief and love. "Thank you," she whispered, "for understanding, for not trying to fix me." "Nothing about you needs fixing," Lucas said firmly. "You're walking your own path with faith in your own time. That's something I respect deeply." The wedding plans were altered. Invitations were amended to direct guests to the Triple V Ranch instead of the church. Reverend Miller, after a thoughtful conversation with the couple, agreed to perform the ceremony on Lucas's land under a canopy of autumn leaves. On their wedding day, October 12, 1876, Abigail wore a cream-colored dress with lace her mother had handmade years before. Lucas stood waiting for her beside a natural arch formed by 2 ancient cottonwoods, looking more handsome than she'd ever seen him in his best suit. As Abigail walked toward him on the arm of her uncle who had traveled from Boston, she felt none of the dread that had accompanied her attempts to enter the church. Instead, with each step, certainty grew within her. This was right. This was where she belonged. The ceremony was simple but profound. When Reverend Miller pronounced them husband and wife, Lucas kissed Abigail with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of understanding and support. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with dancing in the barn and enough food to feed half the county. When the last guests had departed or bedded down in various outbuildings, Lucas carried Abigail across the threshold of their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," he said, setting her gently on her feet in their bedroom. "It feels like home already," she replied, reaching up to touch his face. Because you're here." Their first weeks of marriage were a time of adjustment and discovery. Abigail continued teaching in town, riding to and from the ranch each day on a gentle mare, Lucas had trained especially for her. The addition to the house was completed just before the first snow, giving Abigail a warm, light-filled space for her growing collection of books. Each Sunday, they still stood outside the church while the bells rang. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they simply held hands in silence. Occasionally, Abigail would take a step toward the doors before retreating. Lucas never pushed, never showed impatience. One day, she told him after a particularly difficult Sunday in December, "I'll be ready to go inside. Just not today." "And I'll be right beside you when that day comes," Lucas assured her, "whether it's next Sunday or 10 years from now." Winter settled over the prairie with a vengeance that year. Blizzards howled across the plains, keeping Abigail home from school for days at a time. During those snowbound weeks, she and Lucas grew even closer, reading to each other by lamplight, planning the spring planting, and dreaming of their future together. It was during one such blizzard, as February turned to March, that Abigail realized she was pregnant. The knowledge filled her with both joy and trepidation. "What if I can't be the mother our child needs?" she confessed to Lucas one night, her head resting on his chest. "What if my doubts, my struggles with faith, affect our child?" Lucas's hand stilled on her hair. "Abigail, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "Any child raised with your honesty, your courage in questioning, and your open heart will be blessed beyond measure. Faith that's never questioned isn't faith at all, it's just habit." Abigail's pregnancy progressed through the spring and summer. As her body changed, so too did her relationship with her past. She began reading her father's old Bible again, not with the desperate need for answers she'd once had, but with a new perspective seeking wisdom rather than certainty. On a bright Sunday morning in September, when Abigail was 7 months pregnant, she and Lucas stood in their usual spot across from the church. The bells rang, calling the faithful to worship. Abigail took a deep breath and squeezed Lucas's hand. "I want to try today," she said quietly. Lucas searched her face. "Are you sure?" Abigail nodded. "Our child deserves to know all sides of faith, the questions and the comfort. I can't hide out here forever." "We'll go as far as you're comfortable," Lucas promised, "and leave whenever you need to." Hand in hand they crossed the street. Abigail's heart pounded as they approached the steps she hadn't been able to climb for nearly 2 years. With Lucas beside her, she took the first step, then the second, then the third. At the doors, she paused, trembling slightly. Inside, the congregation was singing a hymn her father had loved. For a moment, grief threatened to overwhelm her. Lucas's steady presence anchored her, reminding her that she wasn't alone. "Ready?" he whispered. Abigail nodded, and together they entered the church. The familiar smells of polished wood and hymn books washed over her. Several heads turned at their entrance, surprise and welcome in equal measure on the parishioners' faces. They slipped into a pew at the back. Abigail's eyes filled with tears as memories of her father flooded back, but these tears were different, cleansing rather than consuming. Lucas kept his arm around her shoulders, a silent reminder of his support. They stayed for the entire service. When it ended, Reverend Miller approached them with genuine pleasure. "It does my heart good to see you both here," he said, clasping their hands. "Especially you, Mrs. Vaughn. I've been praying for your journey." "Thank you," Abigail replied sincerely. "It's been a longer road than I expected, but I'm grateful to be here today." As they walked home afterward, Lucas asked, "How do you feel?" Abigail considered the question carefully. "Like I've closed a circle that needed closing," she finally said. "I don't know if I'll go every Sunday, but today felt right." "That's all that matters," Lucas assured her. Their son, Samuel William Vaughn, was born on a cold November night with the help of the local midwife. He had Lucas's blue eyes and Abigail's stubborn chin, and from his first cry, he held both his parents' hearts completely. The following Sunday, Abigail stayed home with the baby while Lucas went to town for supplies. When he returned, he found her sitting in the rocking chair by the window, singing softly to Samuel. "It was one of my father's favorite hymns," she explained when she noticed Lucas watching from the doorway. "I want Samuel to know his grandfather through the good things he left behind, the music, the stories, the faith that sustained him." Lucas crossed the room and knelt beside them, putting his arm around his wife and son. "He'll know," he promised, "and he'll find his own path just as you have." As Samuel grew, so too did the Triple V Ranch. Lucas's careful management and forward-thinking approaches to breeding and land conservation paid dividends. By the time their son was 5, they had expanded to over 600 acres and had one of the most respected herds in the territory. Abigail continued teaching until their second child, a daughter named Eleanor Grace, was born. After that, she focused on creating a school at the ranch for Samuel, Eleanor, and the children of their ranch hands. Her innovative teaching methods became known throughout the region, and occasionally families would send their children to board with the Vaughns for a proper education. Their relationship with the church evolved into something deeply personal. Some Sundays found them in the pews, others they spent in quiet contemplation under the cottonwoods on their land. Neither approach felt wrong anymore, just different expressions of the same searching spirit. On a spring morning in 1889, Abigail and Lucas stood hand in hand on their porch, watching 13-year-old Samuel teaching his 7-year-old sister to ride. Their family had grown again with the addition of twins, James and Joseph, now 3 years old and currently napping inside. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Staying out here with me. You could have had a different life back east, with libraries and theaters and all the things you grew up with." Abigail turned to face him, taking in the silver now threading his brown hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that had deepened over their 13 years together. "Not for a single moment," she said with absolute conviction. "Everything I need is here. You, our children, our home, our life together." She smiled, remembering the frightened woman who couldn't climb the church steps. "You stood beside me when I couldn't move forward. You waited with me until I found my strength. How could I ever regret choosing a life with someone who loves me so completely?" Lucas pulled her into his arms, kissing her with the same tenderness as on their wedding day. "I'd wait a lifetime for you." "Abigail Vaughn." "You won't have to," she whispered against his lips. "I'm already home." As the years passed, North Platte grew and changed. The railroad brought new faces and opportunities. The harsh prairie was gradually tamed, though never fully conquered. Through it all, the Vaughn family stood as a testament to the power of patience, understanding, and love that grows stronger through adversity. Lucas and Abigail's children grew into adults who carried forward their parents' values. Samuel took over management of the ranch when Lucas's knees became too painful for long days in the saddle. Eleanor became a teacher like her mother, eventually founding a proper school for girls in North Platte. The twins went different ways, James to medical school back east, Joseph to study agriculture at the newly established land-grant university. In the autumn of 1915, 40 years after they first stood outside the church together, Lucas and Abigail sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. At 68 and 63 respectively, they had weathered countless storms, both literal and figurative, but their love had only deepened with time. "Do you remember what you said to me that first Sunday?" Abigail asked, her hand resting comfortably in his. When I couldn't go into the church? Lucas smiled, memory undimmed despite the years. Something about honest doubts being better than false certainties, wasn't it? Abigail nodded. You said God might prefer honest doubts. I've thought about that so often over the years. How different my life would have been if you hadn't stopped that day. I like to think we would have found each other somehow, Lucas said, squeezing her hand. Some things are just meant to be. Abigail leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their legacy play out before them. You know what I've learned after all this time? Faith isn't just about what happens inside a church. It's about standing beside someone when the bells stop ringing and everyone else has gone inside. It's about waiting, without judgment, until they're ready to move forward. Or about having the courage to let someone stand beside you when you're struggling, Lucas added. The church bells of North Platte began to ring in the distance, carrying across the prairie to their ranch. Abigail and Lucas sat in peaceful silence, listening to their familiar cadence. They no longer needed to stand outside the church. They had built their own sanctuary in the life they shared, in the love that had waited patiently for wounds to heal and for new beginnings to emerge from endings. As the final bell echoed across the plains, Abigail turned to her husband, the love of her life, the man who had waited with her until she was ready. Thank you, she said simply. Lucas kissed her gently. For what? For showing me that sometimes the most sacred moments happen outside the church doors, in the waiting. Lucas smiled, the years falling away from his face as he looked at her with the same tenderness he had shown that first Sunday morning. And thank you for teaching me that some things some people are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes. Their grandchildren's laughter filled the air as the bells faded into silence. In that moment, surrounded by the family they had built together, Abigail and Lucas knew with absolute certainty that every step of their journey, even the ones they couldn't take, had led them exactly where they were meant to be.